Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture in this benighted age, one weekly conversation at a time. You can find and subscribe to this podcast via Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, and a whole bunch of other venues. Just visit our site, vmspod.com, to find more information, as well as our RSS feed, which you can plug into any podcatcher so you never miss an episode of the Virtual Memories Show. You can also follow me on Blue Sky, Instagram, and YouTube, where I go by vmspod, and subscribe to my semi-weekly newsletter at buttondown.com/vmspod. Well, it is Inauguration Day 2025, so we are heading into a whole new world. I am gearing up for a bunch of visits to Capitol Hill in the few weeks ahead, now that Congress is in session and committee assignments have been settled, etc. Remains to be seen how the various political appointments and nominations affect my dealings with FDA and HHS, but that's why they pay me the somewhat decent bucks over in my day job as a trade association head for a weird part of the pharmaceutical industry. But well, before I get to editorializing, let's just dive into this week's show. Nobody needs to hear me go on. My guest this time is the writer Fred Kaplan. Now, Fred's been on the podcast in the past for a couple of his nonfiction books, one about David Petraeus and one about cybersecurity and, well, its history and application. But now Fred has his very first novel out, and it is an absolute blast. It's called A Capital Calamity. It's from Miniver Press, and it's Fred's first foray into fiction. And it is a hysterical satire of Washington, D.C. and the national security scene. We'll put it that way. Fred will talk about the plot of A Capital Calamity during the conversation, but I will say, reading this book, his depictions of the D.C. consultant world, the dynamics of Congress and congressional hearings, the misunderstandings and the brinksmanship between countries and between like rival departments and personal relationships. It all feels way too real. I'll put it that way. And throughout, the novel gives us a tour of how the defense and national security worlds work, along with some real Washington, D.C. anthropology without ever really resorting to info dump. Everything comes at the reader in ways that make sense and aren't just, huge paragraphs of exposition or anything. Fred does a masterful job throughout the book of evoking the world without telling us the world. And he does that because he's bringing decades of experience as a reporter in this sector to the book. But the thing is, A Capital Calamity isn't just about the verisimilitude of the setting and the world that Fred's telling us about. He's got this wicked sense of humor and a serious ear for dialogue and a real devotion to his characters. And that comes out throughout the book. Even the villains feel like people, not cutouts. And everyone feels so real that, yeah, you're going to feel like there has to be some real life parallels to a lot of the characters. But they stand on their own. Nobody is, again, just a stand-in for somebody else. And while his lead character, Serge Willoughby, may accidentally and kind of jadedly push us towards World War III, he's got a good heart. There is a redemption arc throughout this book. It is not, although there's a lot of black comedy, it is there's a heart to it all, and there is some sort of redemption, like I say. I'll just put it this way. A Capital Calamity, Fred Kaplan's first novel, is fun, informative, a little nerve-wracking at times, laugh out loud, and an absolute page-turner. So, A Capital Calamity, out now from Miniver Press. Go get it. I loved it. And I think you'll pick up on that from the conversation ahead. Now, here's Fred's bio. Fred Kaplan is Slate's War Stories columnist and the author of 6 nonfiction books, including The Insurgents, David Petraeus and the Plot to Change the American Way of War, which was a New York Times bestseller and a Pulitzer Prize finalist. Others include The Bomb, Dark Territory, 1959, Daydream Believers, and The Wizards of Armageddon. He has written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, the New Yorker, and the New York Review of Books, among many publications, and also reviews jazz records for Tracking Angle. Long ago, Fred was a reporter for the Boston Globe, based in Washington, Moscow, and New York, and during that time was a lead member of the team that won a Pulitzer Prize for a special Sunday magazine on the nuclear arms race. He has been awarded fellowships with the Council of Foreign Relations, New America, the American Academy in Berlin, and the London School of Economics. He graduated from Oberlin College and, like his novel's hero, earned a Ph.D. in political science from MIT, then briefly worked as a defense policy advisor in the U.S. House of Representatives. Unlike his hero, he has never been a consultant. He lives in Brooklyn with his wife, Brooke Gladstone. And now, the 2025 Virtual Memories Conversation with Fred Kaplan. So before we started, you said that a capital calamity began with the pandemic. Tell me how the book came together.
Well, I've been in the national security business for about 40 years. Every once in a while, I'll see something or talk with somebody or observe some weird thing and think, boy, this would make a good satire at some point. And so here it is. And my last book, I've written 6 books, all of them nonfiction narrative books. My last one came out in January of 2020. Weeks afterwards, the lockdown began.
Yeah.
I was getting in the mood to write another book. And, the way I generally write books, I go interview people face-to-face, and I go to archival libraries, because not everything's online.
Yeah. Turn every page.
Yeah. And I couldn't do that, obviously. And so I had this idea for a novel in my mind, and so started out, see where it went.
Tell me about fiction writing compared to the reportage and the long-form nonfiction you do.
Yeah,
what did you have to learn, I guess?
It's very different. It's more different than I thought. A friend of mine who's also a reporter who wrote a novel said, "Oh, this is great. You just make stuff up." But, first, I've never made anything up. I mean, maybe some people think I do, but I haven't.
Or they have plausible deniability.
Yeah. But second, I read someplace that writing a novel, it's not and then, and then, and then. It's and so, and so, and so. In other words, a plot line, there has to be a line, and it's connected through characters in a way that even if it's not entirely realistic, has to be plausible within its framework, And that's hard. That's hard. Also, it was a very interesting creative process that completely unanticipated. So I'd be writing along, and I'd come to the end of an episode, and I'd think, okay, now where does this thing go? It's like you've hit you can go, what happens next? And I didn't know. And then, how sometimes, you get up at about, just vaguely, 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning. It would come to me then. And it actually worked out. This happened 5 or 6 times. Yeah. And this kind of thing had never happened to me with nonfiction. And I asked a couple friends of mine who are novelists or playwrights, and they said, "Oh yeah, this is typical. It happens all the time." Yeah. So and also people doing high-level mathematics, same thing.
Yeah.
Typical. And so I guess, I've sort of unlocked a creative path which is again, very, very typical, but I've never explored it before. So that was fun, seeing how this goes. Also, I unlike some nonfiction writers, I don't make up dialogue and then so-and-so, and then Schultz told him, blah. Yeah. Yeah.
Probably said.
Unless it's in a document or something.
Yeah.
But so inventing dialogue, that part actually came easier than I thought it would. Just kind of embodying characters, and this is how they would talk, and this is what they would say.
And
so there were a lot of things that I've never done before. I had fun exploring.
Did it satisfy the itch, or do you kind of feel like this is another area for...
I don't know.
Not to talk about sequels or anything, but,
Well, as I say, I had the beginning of this book in mind for a long time, and then I had incidents. So I was kind of plowing into, write what you know, that kind of thing. So I'm not quite sure what the next novel would be. I like doing it. If I came up with an idea, I'd be open. I'd be open to it.
It's very funny because at my work on the Hill, because I run a trade association for this weird part of the pharmaceutical industry, people always say, oh, you must have all sorts of great stories. And I literally never thought of fictionalizing any of this stuff until reading this and thought, okay. Because
my life, it's not interesting enough to be a memoir.
Yeah, and that's part of my thing. I'm like, I can make funny anecdotes, but that's not a book.
But you can fit pieces and places and people into a novel. But you do. At the beginning, that's all I had at the beginning. Yeah. I had no idea where a plot was going to go. And you really do need a strong plot, as many people told me. It can't just be, that's a funny character. There are books like that, but they don't hang together.
It's a different genre completely, too. Yeah. So, did you have either writers or novels as influences or a template for you?
Well, again, I'm not meaning to draw comparisons.
No, and I don't mean it in I'm as good as Graham Greene. But,
Well, funny you mentioned Graham Greene, because I reread Our Men in Havana.
Which is exactly the book.
Right before I wrote this, which is a great book. And now, again, this is nothing like this book, but just to get in a funny frame of mind, I read Kingsley Amos's Lucky Jim again, which is, maybe the funniest book ever written. But obviously, Dr. Strangelove is an influence. Thank You for Smoking is an influence. Somebody said that it's like Jane Austen meets Dr. Strangelove in a DC comedy of manners kind of thing. I said, okay, I'll go with that.
I'll take that as a compliment.
I'll take that.
Yeah. In the Loop, the Iannucci film also jumped to mind. But
So, sure, there are...
at least, vibes out there.
And these are things like I didn't study up. These are things that appeal to me naturally. Yeah. So it's to someone who knows my taste in what I read in movies and other things, the fact that I've written something like this wouldn't come as a complete surprise.
Yeah. When it was sent to me, I had that makes all the sense in the world. Okay, this is the novel Fred was born to write. So, although to that end, let me ask, the lead character, Serge, shares your educational upbringing, about your age. Do we consider...
Well, a little bit younger. But
I was going to say, he comes off, I think it's 61.
60,
a Fred not traveled? Should we consider him? Or did you kind of...
Well, look, here's the thing. First, we should maybe say what this book is about.
Oh, there's that, certainly.
So it's about a defense consultant named Serge Willoughby. And the opening line is, Serge Willoughby just wanted to make money and have fun. He didn't mean to start World War III. It's about this he's a cynical defense consultant, which is to say he'll do a study in favor of a bomber for the Air Force, and then turn right around and do an anti-bomber study for the Navy to make twice the money. He calls his think tank, he calls it the Janus Corporation, the two faces. And so one day he does something very mischievous that accidentally triggers World War III, a war with China, and he has to figure out a way to backpedal it. And in the course of which, because this is a book with a moral arc, he comes to understand that, yes, much of life is a joke, and people in Washington, most of them don't have real opinions. Their opinions are based on what their interests are. But once in a while, something happens, and you have to figure out what it means to be responsible and to act accordingly. And that's, that it does address a certain dilemma, especially in the brief period when I did live in Washington, of how much to be an insider, how much to be an outsider, how much to just dismiss everything going on as cynical, even if I personally wasn't cynical, and how much to treat it as something, okay, well, I really have to try to step aboard here and try to influence what's happening. I think a lot of people who work in any profession that has an impact on the public and where they've been inside enough to know there's something sordid about a lot that's going on.
Yeah.
They face this dilemma, and they face, well, what do I do if I'm responsible for something that's gone awry, and how do I get out of it?
Yeah.
So that's part of what this book is about.
Did you have a similar conversion experience that Serge has at the beginning of his career, the thing that triggers a cynicism?
Well, without going into a lot of detail, something happens which is true based on where he realizes Serge Gwent, he's a mathematician. He believes in the power of, as a young man, power of mathematical precision and rational analysis to explore, as the basis for making decisions about national policy. And there's an incident which is based on something that really happened when I worked on the Hill, where he realizes that people don't believe anything. It's all nonsense. And it has to do with where the underlying rationale for a particular weapon system changed completely, and yet the people who were for the weapon system just made the switch, and people against it made the switch, and he realized it's all just nonsense. And he gets very cynical and becomes a consultant. Okay. When that happened, when I was working on the Hill, no, it didn't disillusion me. It didn't surprise me. It confirmed everything that I was coming to believe. Yeah. But I didn't have a.
You weren't wide-eyed at that point.
I was not a wide-eyed soul who then had a disillusioning experience and just decided to go off and make money off of it. I did become a journalist. Maybe that's one thing that happened.
Make less money off of it. I'm just kidding. That
turned out, unfortunately, not to be the case. Good. But, I realized, partly for that reason, because at the time, the congressman I was working for Les Aspin, who was, before he became the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, much less before he became Secretary of Defense. He was still kind of a maverick when I started working for him. And this still isn't well known, but when Ted Kennedy made his abortive run for the president, challenging Jimmy Carter, Les was his unofficial defense advisor, which means that I was his unofficial I was writing stuff for him. Yeah. So I was like a 25-year-old kid, and I would write stuff, and I would watch Ted Kennedy on Meet the Press reciting lines that I had written. Yeah. And I was thinking, wow, this is great. So I was thinking if he'd become president, I probably would have gotten some junior staff position on the National Security Council or something. That's kind of where I was headed. And then this experience, as well as other things that happened, made me realize, no, I'm just not cut out for this. I mean, Les Aspin and I had a big disagreement on something, and that's why I quit. So, I mean, I'm not the kind of guy who could say, well, I put in my best argument, and
but I'll back the team.
I have to go with him now, and I just don't do that. So that's when I realized that I was not cut out for public life, even on the peripheries. Yeah. And I'd always been writing, and even freelancing, even while I worked on the House. So yeah, to become a newspaper reporter, which I was for 20 years, and then a columnist, that seemed more where I was naturally headed.
I will say from my time dealing with Hill staff, who are always 25 years old, by the way.
Yes, exactly.
Which is one of those.
It's a good time to do that.
It's a weird thing. My lead lobbyist down in Washington's my age, mid-50s. And the first time we were down on the Hill, everybody knew him. And, hey, man, we're getting together for, blah, blah, blah. And I said to him, dude, we're twice the age of everybody here. How does this work? He's like, well, somebody has to stick around. Yeah. Somebody has to know how things work and explain to the young people.
And you see people like that.
Yeah, it's. I've learned a lot. the biggest lesson is simply, and it's sort of what Serge goes through. The proximity to power just warps everything.
It
like
corrupts.
anybody who says, how does Lindsey Graham possibly defend Trump and this, that, and the other? I'm like, it's proximity. It's better to be close to power than to be out of power. And that's...
We don't quite see what Lindsey's getting out of it. I mean, he didn't get to be Secretary of Defense.
No, but it's that proximity. It's getting to be on the golf course and saying a couple of things.
Go play golf with the man.
Yeah.
I guess. Well, look, Les Aspin, Bill Clinton appointed him Secretary of Defense. He knew that he should not have taken that job. He was not an executive personality. Mm-hmm. He was a legislative master.
Yeah, and those are very different
master.
things.
And he was chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, which he could have had for the rest of his life. And he was having fun doing that job. He knew that he should not have taken that job. He was a disaster at it. He got fired after a year. He died not long after. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it's one person told me it's the king's game. The president invites you to do something, and it's like, God,
I can't say no.
How do you, you're in the game, sort of.
Yeah.
So how do you pass that up?
Right.
And so one way to pass that up is just not to get into it at all, because you see the temptations affecting people who go that route. Yeah. And hey, sometimes it's great, and somebody has to take these jobs, and you hope as a citizen that it's someone who knows what he's doing, right?
And has some moral compass to them.
Yeah,
but,
yeah.
Fun to fictionalize possible World War III?
Well, I did. It's not really about. It starts.
No, but
no, because there are novels where we're doing a simulation of what a war.
Yeah, you're not Tom Clancying it.
It's not that, and that admiral.
But the
he's written
steps.
a couple books. It's more about the culture.
Yeah.
This is a book about Washington culture.
Yeah.
A certain kind of people who are involved with certain institutions. How it's kind of a comical how things work. Richard Clark, who former White House counterterrorism, he said in his little blurb for it he called it an only slightly exaggerated, darkly humorous look at national security and unthinkable nuclear war. Those phrases in quotes. So yeah, that's kind of how I looked at it. This. My epigraph for the book is much of what follows is true except for the plot. So people who read this who are into the field, they recognize certain people. They recognize, if not the precise event, something very close like it. They recognize how this kind of person operates, how they interact. One defense consultant who isn't, well, one of my characters is based a little bit on him, but he said, I read your book in one sitting, and there were places where I thought I was reading the story of my own career.
I was wondering if you were bugging me. Yeah.
So, it's meant as that kind of work.
Most surprising blurb?
Most surprising blurb?
Either from either a surprising person, even though you helped develop the blurb list, or did somebody say something that really just...
A little bit of it. Some of it, but a lot of it's just, Jeffrey Lewis, who has the Arms Control Wonk podcast, and who wrote one of these kind of imaginative novels about a war with North Korea. Mm-hmm. It was as a study that was written 10 years after how it happened, that kind of thing. And he said, this is like Jane Austen meets Dr. Strangelove comedy of manners in D.C., which, I hadn't thought of it in that way. I can't say that I have read all of Jane Austen's novels, but I said, okay, that's pretty good. I'll go for that. The comedy of manners, Dr. Strangelove, yeah.
And you capture the cocktail party scene.
The cocktail party,
very well.
Yeah, very early on, there's a scene where Serge walks into a cocktail party of the defense consultant scene, and different factions are in different corners. The intelligence people are over here, the congressional people are over there, and how they're interacting. And listen, when I lived in Washington, which was a while ago, but I'm told this is still the case. I mean, I was describing the kind of
scene from
many
back
of the
then.
parties that
Yeah.
I would walk into. This is what they were like. You could tell where the different groups of people were standing and how they were interacting with each other, and what kind of deals they were making or avoiding.
It is a culture I'm happy that I pay somebody else to deal with as a lobbyist. I had to register as a lobbyist as part of all this, which I still like to believe I'm the only graduate of Hampshire College who can say he's a lobbyist for the pharmaceutical industry. But
That's probably a fair claim.
I have to think there can't be another one. But,
You would have met him by now.
yeah, in all likelihood, we'd be running around the hill together. But to me, it was a weird resonance, but just the defense hearing that you have.
Oh, yeah.
Which raised the question for me. I'm sure you attended hearings besides, watching on C-SPAN. Have you ever had to testify?
No,
Okay.
I never testified. Let me just say something about this hearing. He's going to be meeting with the Secretary of Defense is testifying. He's going to be meeting with him afterwards, so he goes to sit at this hearing, and he kind of dreads it because this was what he used to do. And So my portrayal of this hearing might strike some readers as the most clearly exaggerated, in fact, completely made up thing. But in fact,
100%.
It is completely everything that you read in that about the absurd questions that people ask. I mean, some of them are close to being transcribed.
Yes.
And fairly recent. I mean, these were hearings that I watched on C-SPAN when I no longer worked on the Hill. So when you get to that part.
It had the most verisimilitude of any, for me, in my experience. I've testified once just with a congressional subcommittee, but...
And then at the end, the Secretary of Defense gets in his limo and starts barking out the foulest obscenities. And that is taken from Robert Gates's memoir. He was Secretary of Defense for Bush and Obama, where he said that while some secretaries of defense prepare for hearings by rehearsing very cool, calm answers, he would rehearse by shouting out the foulest obscenities just to get it all out of his system. And what's happened in my portraying of it is that he'd had to go to a White House meeting before the hearing. And so he didn't have time. So he's letting it all out
to vent all the cursing. Yeah.
But in that, now the Secretary of Defense in my book, a guy named James Weed Portis, he's not. It's a little bit based on Gates. It's a little bit based on a couple of other people. But he is a type. I mean, again, I'm not writing this entirely for people in the field, but
there's enough Easter eggs.
People in the Easter eggs. I like to think there is no inauthentic character in this entire book.
They feel real. And again, having read your reportage for too many years, I guess, I'll just say a whole lot of years.
It for too many years.
Again, the characters feel like lived experience, whether they're verbatim or composite or
there's one that's like whole cloth and quite a few composite, and one or two that are completely invented.
So along the lines of the reporting side of things, and with the fictionalizing the steps towards World War III, just between us, do you feel like we're slow walking into the big one right now?
Well, you rarely know it's happening when it's happening. These are appraisals in retrospect.
But
I mean, I would say this: there are a bunch of different conflicts going on in the world.
Yeah.
The players in some of them have some of them are in common. They're forming axes or alliances. Particularly Russia, China, North Korea, Iran. Although Iran and Russia have been severely weakened recently by the evaporation of Assad's regime in Syria. And then you have a system common to what you had in World War I, namely an international system that has completely gone up in smoke in the years before, which, before World War I, it was the Congress of Vienna. Before now, it was the Cold War. The Cold War was, a horrible time. I mean, I lived through it, you lived through it, but it was also a system of international security. it kind of, there were
it was strangely stable.
Yeah, there were two powers that kind of divided the world between them, and while there were a lot of proxy wars within those, within that overall conflict, there were no big wars, and there was a reason for that, and they kind of kept the peace in a certain way. I think one could say if the Cold War hadn't ended and if the Soviet Union had stayed solvent, and I'm not saying this at all as an apology for the Soviet Union, but if that had happened, I don't think you would have seen the rise of things like Al-Qaeda. I don't think you would have seen the splintering of the Middle East into, the borders kind of that had been established at the end of World War I and II disappearing. So when the big system melts away, then the kind of natural tendencies toward violence and anarchy and kind of disputes that don't have any power to contain them, they aren't contained. And the UN really doesn't do what it's supposed to do. And there is no, no kind of natural international control. So, the chances of conflict erupting and conflicts overlapping and escalation kind of happening and getting out of control is, it's certainly, let's put it this way, it's something that I didn't really worry about 10 years ago that is worth worrying about now.
I'll say the World War I comparisons also, again, nuclear weapons make everything a different consideration.
They make breaking out into war both less likely because, hey, it does have a deterring impact, right?
Yeah.
But at the same time, it makes the possibility of catastrophic destruction, if it does break out, of course, much, much greater. I mean, it's hard to imagine certain kinds of wars not spilling over into the use of nuclear weapons, and once that happens, nobody knows anything.
Right. I'll just say, though, that Syria is what made me start to feel like we're tripping into a World War I scenario. North Korea getting involved with Russia is one thing. When you start to see second-order effects, like, oh, yeah, by the way, this regime that was in power for 50 years just collapsed and rebels just took over and changed the entire landscape.
Well, that could go either way.
Oh, yeah.
Let's see what happens.
Yeah.
I'm
it just feels like little steps that
what is it? Optimism of the heart, pessimism of the mind, or something. I mean, it's worth noting that none of the Arab Spring states are now democracies. They have all reverted to dictatorships of one sort or another. So you look at this and you see this Salafi Islamist taking over most of Syria, but there are still conflicts between his faction and other rebel groups, and he can talk a good game about I'm for pluralism, but he didn't run his little province of Syria that way. So I don't know.
You are one of the key resources for me when I'm trying to figure out the world, is always your war stories column. So
thank you. In Slate, we should say.
Yes, always the Slate pieces. But I will say the other weird aspect, by the way, of my job, which ended up overlapping with your world, is that this summer I received my first emails that were coming from an nsc.gov domain and had one of those, that's not supposed to happen in my life.
Oh, wait, NSC or NSA?
Because, NSC. Okay. NSA,
they have their own. They have their own blog now. And,
I got dragged into some national security, China-related pharma issues, and it turned into. Well, it was an interesting trip because as of now, we'll see when the continuing resolution language comes out in the next couple of days. I've spent the last 10 months becoming an expert and preparing my industry for a bill that Congress has been advancing because there's no way this could fail. This has to go through. That has not gone through and is all likelihood going to die. And it was one of those moments where I've always prefaced discussing it with, if this goes through, and everything that Congress discusses could always fall apart. But the way it was portrayed to me by congressional staff was always national security. This has to happen, that we're losing this war to China, blah, blah, blah. And then it was, yeah, it turns out it didn't make it into the NDAA, so we'll bring it up in the next Congress.
There are a lot of things that people say they want, but they really don't.
Yeah.
Like, for example, Republicans, most of them really don't want Obamacare to disappear.
Yeah.
Too many of their constituents really like it. So they can talk like this a lot, but if it really happened, they'd figure out some way to tank it. Mm. Yeah.
But there's that degree of the abrogating responsibilities monologue that you have a character deliver in the book that had me thinking, no, this is what's happening with my biosecure thing, where everybody has something at stake, and yet somehow nothing gets done, and the consultants, et cetera, just kind of walk off, and here's my invoice. But so I'm impressed and happy, and also, sad to see my life mirrored darkly through this book. But, you did mention that the pandemic slowed you down on getting back to longer nonfiction project. Working on a...
No, I'm not, and now, I think with the resumption of Trump, I think I'm going to be... My column writing days are going to be very busy. There's lots of stuff to write about, and much as I would like to, I would think burrowing into some Cold War saga, from 40 years ago, would just be a bit of an escape. I mean, I've chosen. People say, "Gee, are you gonna leave? What country are you going to go to?" And they said this last time too, right? Yeah. And my view is, I've had a pretty cushy life, being able to write pretty much what I want to write, and getting paid for it, and and enjoying things that this country has to offer, and whether in reality or aspirationally. So things get rough. I'm just gonna split.
Time to go to
No, I don't know. I mean, if the worst nightmare scenarios happen, which I don't think they will, and the pardoned members of January 6th start being sent out to arrest people like me, then maybe it's time to think about it.
Best
I don't have a big martyrs complex. I don't aspire to have some newspaper's reading room named after me or something. Mm-hmm. So then I might get out of here. But otherwise, no. I think it's a bit self-congratulatory to even talk about. Like, I'm such a big person, I really have to leave and make a statement.
It's been a question for my world, just whether my friends at FDA will stick around.
Well, that's another matter. Whether it's worth staying in an agency that's being torn apart.
But that's also in there's the calculus of, do I leave? Do I abdicate responsibility and walk, or does somebody have to stay here to try to make sure things are? Well, and it's a real tough call, as we saw during the pandemic.
But it can go both. And you really think you might. I mean, the history is littered with people who, stayed in senior Pentagon positions during the Vietnam War, say, because, it would have been really bad if I had left, Well, okay, but what did you do, really? Looking back, what were you able to do about it?
It's a Iannucci line.
And is it better to leave and then rail from the outside with the expertise that you have?
Yeah.
If Robert McNamara had left the Pentagon when he was first thinking about leaving the Pentagon because of the war, mainly, 65, 66, not 68.
Yeah.
And if he had spoken out, that might have mattered, instead of just sitting there and just getting embroiled and further immersed, and then kidding himself that he was still doing better than what
that if somebody else was here. That's that line from In the Loop near the end when the general decides to stick around, and you said it was unbearable. Yeah, but now that it happened, I have to bear it. And he just keeps going.
But no, you're right. It's a dilemma, and once you get into this world, it's something that you have to think about. What you do if. Where do you draw the line? You should always have, a resignation letter in the drawer.
Yeah.
When do you take it out? And then what do you do about it?
Right. because in the past we would always say,
you just leave and say, well, I more time with my family. Or,
personal reasons.
Other
opportunities.
And and go teach at a university and don't say anything.
So do you have lessons from the previous Trump administration in terms of how you think you would look to cover things, or do you think things are going to be radically different than 2017 to 21 in terms of...
I think I'll cover it the same way, but what's different... The first couple years that Trump was in office, he really kind of didn't know anything. And he picked aides who a lot of them were establishment people.
Yeah.
He said they looked right out of central casting. Remember
always that line, yeah.
And people had said, this... And basically they obstructed quite a bit. They got in and blocked purposefully some of the things he wanted to do. Well, now he has a much better sense of what he wants to do. He's much more confident in himself. Winning the popular vote, he takes that kind of thing seriously. He's picked people who either will do what he wants to do or who are so incompetent that they'll completely destroy the agency that he appointed them to destroy. That's
as you wrote in a recent column. Yeah.
This is a much more dangerous time because he's more competent. He understands the way things work, and he also, you don't have to be a brilliant intelligence analyst working for a foreign government to know how to deal with this guy. The way you deal with him is his buttons are right on his sleeve. You compliment him. You go meet with him in Mar-a-Lago. You call him sir. So people are doing this now because, if people who think that America is in decline, look at the way foreign leaders are treating Trump. They want to be in good stead with the United States. The United States is still a very powerful country. They want to be in good stead. And so they need to be in good stead with this guy. And what they're doing now, which he takes as a sign of great respect, is actually they're kissing his ass and then saying, here's what we really need, Mr. President, and hoping that he'll go, I see that. And by the way, these are both good guys and bad guys doing this. So there's going to be a lot more to cover. Hold on to your hats.
Well, I would say,
on the scale, I would rather be sitting around twiddling my thumbs. By the way,
at no point was I thinking
jazz records or
Years ago, when he first got elected, I said to the political cartoonist Tom Tomorrow the same thing everybody else said to him with, well, at least you've got a lot of material for the next 4 years. Drove his life into the ground trying to cover that, and now he's ready to, facing another 4 years of it. You did mention sitting around listening to jazz records. I want to ask you, in addition to having put out your top 10 jazz albums of 2024 list, something that came up when I recorded with Simon Critchley a couple of months ago. Do you just listen to music by itself without doing something else? Do you have that communal experience?
Well, you mean, do I do that occasionally?
Yeah.
Yeah, I do.
Because for a lot of us, it's
I know, it's just stuff in the background,
or it's or we're streaming it, so it's part of a device.
No. Thing. As you look in my living room, you see I have a turntable, I have a CD player, I have a fancy stereo hookup.
Yeah.
I also have streaming devices and so forth. But no, there are times when I will just sit down and listen to a record.
Yeah.
It's been put on a slab of vinyl, and
because I've been debating doing that. I'm debating finally making the move to vinyl for that very reason, to have a separate thing. We
can talk about what you should do.
That'll be once we're off mic, because we won't turn this into Consumer Reports or anything. But there's that sense of how we just need that sort of time.
Now you asked about, to get back to an earlier question that I kind of took in a different direction, was I think you were asking how much of Serge Willoughby is me.
That's what I was going to get to also with the various interests.
I would say, there's a certain thing. I mean, as I said, he's much more cynical than I am. I mean, I think I'm skeptical, even dark, but I'm not cynical. I mean, I I have views, I have principles. You know, he also kind of flits around romantically. I've been married to the same woman for 41 years, you know. Yeah. So I'm not that. I don't play things two ways for mercurial gain, you know. But in terms of his taste in art and music and design and his love of, you know, jazz and stand-up comedy and things like that, I'll admit, it's practically autobiography.
Yeah. And that's what felt very Fred when I had... For the big scene that takes place in New York, which we don't have to talk about.
The climactic, the penultimate chapter takes place at the Comedy Cellar in New York. Yeah. There really is a Comedy Cellar. The owner really is a guy named Noam Dorman who gave me permission to use his name and the name of the club. That's another thing where you know, like I mentioned earlier, these things just come to you. I was like, okay, this meeting, what happened? You know, a big meeting is about to take place where a piece is going to be resolved. And it was like, oh, geez, where do I go with this? Where do I go? And I went to bed, and about 5 o'clock in the morning, I think
That's one of those.
The meeting should happen at the Comedy Cellar. And it's like, it made me laugh. And you know, it should make you laugh. You know, at the end of one chapter is him saying, I know just the place. Yeah. Then the beginning of the next chapter is, the Comedy Cellar is, and you go, what? The Comedy Cellar, really?
Yeah. Works great. And again, the shading you give to his character and, you know, why it means so much to him is
great. And that's actually, I haven't talked with him since I gave him the book, but it's him, basically. Yeah.
Also a shout out to Michael Kinsley at one point.
It's the only other totally real. He's not actually in the book, but people remember a story about Michael Kinsley that really did happen.
Yeah. Is your editor at Slate, or I forget if he was?
Well,
I forget if he edited
the first time I wrote something for Slate, I wasn't working there permanently. He was the editor there. By the time I started working there, he'd gone. But yeah, you know, and I knew Michael from when he was at the New Republic. I mean, I've known him for...
I figure. Again, Washington
when
fixture.
When I first went to... the community of Washington writers when I moved there in the late 70s. You know, it's...
It's dating one of us to bring that up. So, as far as the jazz records go, recommendation for 1, 2, or 3? I'm blanking on who you actually had at number 1.
Or you mean this year?
For 24, yeah.
This year? Well, you know, I think... Charles Lloyd's The Sky Will Still Be Here Tomorrow. Now, the funny thing about that, it's a double album. It's like 90 minutes. I think about 20 minutes of it you could get rid of with no problem at all, but the rest is just sublime.
Yeah.
There's a percussionist named a composer, Kahil El-Zabar, in the Ethnic Heritage Ensemble, who's in Chicago. I've never seen him in New York. I saw him in London when I was there last year. But he has an album called Open Us. It's just gorgeous. And another gorgeous album is a duet of trumpeter Wadada Leo Smith and Amina Carmen Myers called Central Park's Mosaics. Just gorgeous. And I said in the introduction to my top 10 piece this year is that a lot of the albums this year are kind of mellow in a way, or at least spiritual, or they're things to meditate on. And this may be a coincidence, or just may be what I'm looking for, and probably what a lot of people are looking for.
Slowing down.
Yeah. At the same time, I think one of the best historical finds is an album called Miles in France, 63 to 64. Miles Davis. It was the beginning of his great quintet of the mid-60s, and it's right at the beginning of it. So what you hear is him playing the old book, stuff from Kind of Blue and standards, but he's got these young people like Tony Williams and Herbie Hancock, and they're pushing him in a direction that's more like, you know, where Coltrane was going, or Ornette, more free jazz. So it's this tension between structure and innovation, and it's absolutely thrilling. And it's 6 CDs, and 5 of them are of music that's never been released before.
Yeah.
Which, you think, there are certain people like Miles Davis, Bill Evans, Coltrane. Here's a new album of Bill Evans in Norway. Oh, really? You got that one too? Like, where are all these tapes coming from? And where it's like, remember about 10 years ago, they actually found footage of Babe Ruth, pointing to the right center and hitting a home run over the right field. And it's like, wow, there actually was somebody took a film of that. Jeez, you've read about it. So who knows what else is out there in terms of film or tape but they just keep coming along. In his memoir, Miles Davis said, they taped me everywhere I went. They're probably going to be making a lot of money after I die. Well, here we are. Yeah.
It's more modern than this, but I've long joked that I may own more live Joe Jackson music than Joe Jackson does. But that's just one of those. I started going through my iTunes library thinking, how did I end up with all this? I mean, I'm glad to have it, but
absolutely.
But you feel that sense of discovery still with music? Or is that a sense of joy, I guess?
No, I think, look, as a jazz person, I don't know, are we ever going to have a time like the late 50s and early 60s with Miles and Coltrane and Dubs? Probably not, but there are very interesting things going on. I mean, I was just with Carnegie Hall Zankel last night watching singers Cecile McLaurin-Salvant and Solomon Fortner, the pianist, doing duets from all over the map. She sings from all over the map, and it's just gorgeous, and I think... I don't know. I think she ranks among the top singers at any time, and does a lot more than what they were equipped or willing to do. So no, I still think there's a lot of very exciting things going on in music.
Yeah, I feel like it's, we'll just say, a less mythical time. Everybody is so exposed and open. I guess it's
like when I remember several years ago, John Zorn started playing music from, all over the world. And he said, well, look, you can get all this music. Unlike 20 years ago, online, there's the music of Indonesia. The music and so here it's out there. Why not draw on it? I mean, the great musicians of the 40s, 50s, 60s, they drew on Broadway shows, pop music of the day. Yeah. And you draw on what's out there, and what's out there now is the world. Look at the kinds of stuff Kronos Quartet is doing and has been doing for 10, 15 years. Music from literally all over the world. The leader, David Harrington, is listening to tapes and streaming constantly from people everywhere. And that affects the music. And, the idea of a string quartet saying, well, Jason, what do you think? Should we do the Brahms this season or the Ravel? There are string quartets that do that. Yeah. But
they know their lane.
There was a time when Brahms and Ravel were alive, and it was fine that you were doing just that. Yeah. But now, I mean, how can you just stick with that? There's the opening up of the world. We've talked about in some ways it creates this anarchy, but in the arts, it opens up all kinds of possibilities that nobody was even thinking about before.
Again, dating ourselves, I remember when there was the David Byrne, world music was the term applied to everything. Brazil. Yeah, and it was just one of those.
That was world music.
There's a bigger world than that, but okay, at least that's somewhere not the
somewhere
U.S.
that's outside of Tin Pan Alley. Yeah,
just different world. It's although let me ask. You're on Blue Sky now. After Twitter had its.
I'm still on Twitter too.
But, I bailed there long enough ago that I can't tell who's around anymore. Do you feel like it's a different? Do you have a different persona?
No, I don't. I don't.
You pretty much just talk about.
Even though Slate has changed a lot since I'm pretty much doing what I've always done.
Yeah.
I don't put on. Well, I mean, I guess somebody said they didn't know that I could write this funny. I mean, Capital Calamity, it's a funny novel.
Yeah.
And my columns, there might be little bits of wit or humor, but they're not.
But they're derived from.
They're not laugh out loud funny. Yeah. So but I don't. I don't write differently when I'm writing, except to I've written a few things for the New Yorker, and when you write for the New Yorker, you write in a certain. So beyond. But no, I don't. For social media, I'm not going to be a different person on Blue Sky than what I was on Twitter. I don't think there's enough
reason.
Well, not only that, but there aren't enough lines or characters to even put out a character in any event. So.
But happy that you found a comedic voice on the page, you know.
Yeah, it was a, you know, yeah, it was good to put it on the page. I've had it in real life for some time, I think, to some degree, but
it's one thing when there's stories you tell at a party versus a narrative that carries, as well as this does. I enjoyed,
it's funny. I know some writers who say, "Oh, it's like I feel like I have a needle in my arm and I'm pulling out blood, and oh, it's torture to write." And I'm thinking, wow, okay. I mean, I've always enjoyed writing. Actually, I mean, it's work, and sometimes it's hard, especially getting started, and then you get lost and you figure out, what am I doing? But I mean, give me a break. This is a privileged life. I mean,
everybody has the hardest job ever. That's my biggest lesson of my adult life.
I don't care I don't care if you're James Joyce. This is not the hardest work ever.
I know.
And I can't imagine how it could be. And if it is the hardest work ever, and if you're a writer, then maybe you're in the wrong line of work.
I'll take my example from my day job was once coming back from an FDA negotiation. Train gets delayed, long ass day. I'm burned out, pissed off about everything, wondering what the hell I'm doing with my life. Leaving Newark Penn Station to drive home. It's like 9:00 at night in August in Newark, and they're doing construction on 280. And at the traffic light, a construction worker goes walking by carrying this giant length of pipe. He is gray from head to toe from dust, sweating away. And I'm thinking to myself, Gil, you don't have a difficult job, man. That guy his job sucks. I got to sit in the Acela in first class.
He might find it satisfying too.
Oh yeah.
He's building a building,
but it's tougher than my job for sure.
Yes.
So last question, which you may remember from 2016, I always ask, what have you been reading?
What have I been reading?
I should have warned you, but
well, I've been reading. It's not a new book. I think it came out like 10 years ago. It's called The Invention of Nature by Andrea Wolf. It's about Alexander von Humboldt, who was this 19th century German guy who basically, he was a scientist, he was a polymath of a scientist and an explorer. He went all over the world. And he basically invented the view and concept of nature as we now know it, of nature, the different parts of nature being all interlocked.
Yeah.
And it's just a fascinating book. And I'm reading this. I mean, I heard of Humboldt because there's the Humboldt Forum in Berlin. There's the Humboldt this, the Humboldt. But I had no idea about any of this stuff. So that's just a fascinating book. I would, if you're interested in the natural world, it's an amazing book.
Yeah, I had a great one earlier this year. It was a repeat guest, Christopher Brown, The Natural History of Empty Lots. All about edgelands, and particularly in his case in Austin, but the way our conception of the natural world overlaps with what we do in terms of the settled urban world of man. It's I have an extra copy. I'll foist one off on you at some point. So, but Fred, I will be reading the war stories on a regular basis, but I am looking forward to, maybe a sequel to Serge's life or another area for you to go in for another novel.
Well, there was toward the end of the book, everything is fine. And his friend, who is a CIA director, says, so, you had enough adventure? And he goes, well, I'm thinking about making peace in the Middle East. And so somebody said, is that the sequel? And I said, well, I doubt it, but we'll see. We'll see.
There's always time.
Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Sure. Thank you.
And that was Fred Kaplan. Go Get a Capital Calamity, out now from Miniver Press. It really is a hoot and, a fun novel, a nerve-wracking novel, an entertaining novel, and one that'll get you thinking about the world that we're walking into right now. I hope you got a chunk of that from our conversation here. So I do feel like with the new administration coming in, we could maybe use a little distillation of the absurdity of Washington, D.C., as Fred brings us in the book. Anyway, make sure you also read Fred's War Stories column on Slate.com. As I said, I find that indispensable when it comes to making sense of international relations and conflicts. You also ought to check out Fred's jazz reviews at Tracking Angle. And you can find out more about Fred and his writing and his other books and some of his appearances and interviews, etc. at fredkaplan.info. And that's FredKaplan.info. Fred Kaplan, all one word. He's on Blue Sky as Fred M. Kaplan, also one word, and on Facebook as author Fred Kaplan. I'll have links to all that stuff as well as all of his books in the show and episode notes for this one. Thanks for listening to the Virtual Memories Show. You can support this podcast by telling other people about it. There's no better way to build an audience than through word of mouth. Also, visit Apple's podcast page for us and leave a rating and review. Every little bit helps, you know? You can also support the show by telling me what you like and don't like about it and who you'd like to hear me record with or what movie or TV show or book or piece of music or comic or theater or art exhibition or whatever you think I should turn listeners on to. And you can do that by sending me a postcard, letter, email, DM if we're connected on Instagram or Blue Sky, or by leaving a message on my Google Voice number, which is 973-869-9659. Messages can be up to 3 minutes long. It'll cut you off after that, so call back and leave another message if you do. And let me know if it would be okay to include your message in an upcoming episode of the show. You might have something interesting to share with our listeners, but I'd never run someone's message without their permission, so let me know. Now, if you've got money to spare, I appreciate it, but don't give it to me. I've got a day job that pays the bills. You should give to individuals and institutions in need. You can find people through GoFundMe, Patreon, Kickstarter, Crowdfunder, Indiegogo, all those crowdfunding platforms, where you'll find people who really need help just trying to make ends meet or get an artistic project going, covering medical bills or car payments or veterinary bills, and just a few dollars from you might make a real difference in their lives. Now, when it comes to institutions, I give to my local food bank and World Central Kitchen every month, but there are a lot of other things you can give to the Poor People's Campaign, Freedom Funds, Election Funds, Planned Parenthood, and Women's Choice. There's a lot of things you can do with your money to try to help build a better world, so I hope you'll give. Now, our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You can visit my archives at vmspod.com to check out my 2018 conversation with Hal, where you can learn more about his art, his music, and more. And you can follow Hal on SoundCloud at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. That's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode. Thank you so much for listening. I'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download all our past episodes at Apple Podcasts and other podcast sources. And you can find all my episodes and sign up for the Virtual Memories Show newsletter at vmspod.com. And I'm also on Blue Sky and Instagram and YouTube as vmspod. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.